Hey, welcome to this episode of Weekly On the Water Whiskey Breakfast. Today we're coming at you from the back porch because it's been raining for 5 days and 5 nights. It's kind of gloomy weather that makes people in Wisconsin and the UP resort to cannibalism. We certainly don't want that to happen. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about the historical resurrection of a bourbon brand. When I first saw Yellowstone whiskey a few months ago, I thought, well, someone's trying to capitalize off of a new television series, because who doesn't want to be like Rip? But boy, was I wrong. Yellowstone actually was a very popular brand in the early 1900s until the distillery sold in 1920s, I think, and went defunct. So someone's come along, and his name is Stephen Beam. Stephen Beam is about the millionth great-grandson of Jacob Beam. Jacob Beam is the grandfather of Jim Beam, and Jim Beam has a grandson named Minor Case Beam, who is the grandfather of Stephen Beam. His other grandfather, J.B. Dant, owned the Yellowstone distillery. Well, after they sold it and it went defunct, Stephen went into another business and was in that business all of his life until he wanted to start a distillery. So he went to the Kentucky Bourbon Museum and found the actual copper yeast pot that his grandfathers had donated back in the 70s to the museum. He took the pot to the University of California and they extracted enough dormant yeast to clone the legacy 100-year-old yeast to make this Yellowstone whiskey. So he began the distillation process with all of this, basically legacy yeast, and in that created a bourbon that would be like what bourbon tasted like 100 years ago. So what does it taste like? Well, it tastes like regular bourbon. It's got, a little bit of almost, you can smell leather in it when you smell it. It's got some cherries, it's got some caramel, it's got some brown sugar, it's got all of that, but it's not quite as sweet as a modern bourbon. So those flavors come through a little more. It's a pretty good bourbon if a drier bourbon is your thing. So I'd like to applaud Stephen Beam, number one, for basically recognizing his grandfather's achievements, and number two, for letting us taste the bourbon that basically is what bourbon would have tasted like 100 years ago. So thank you, Stephen Beam. That wraps it up. I want to thank everybody for being here with us today. Everybody have a great weekend. Hopefully the sun will come out so we don't go into a depressive funk and cannibalize our families, and we'll see you next week.